I always knew the neighborhood had some quirks, but I never imagined that standing my ground against a power-hungry HOA president would lead to my entire house being demolished, like it was trash. It all started the day I moved into the small, peaceful property I inherited from my grandfather, modest but well-maintained. Home sitting just outside the lines of the Meadowbrook Lakes HOA. Legally speaking, I wasn't part of the HOA. My lot was grandfathered in, but that didn't stop Helen, the self-appointed queen of Meadowbrook, from trying to rope me into her control web. She approached me the first week I arrived, clipboard in hand, fake smile plastered across her face, and handed me a welcome packet that looked more like a military handbook than a neighborly greeting. "We'll just need your signature at the bottom," she chirped, tapping the page that declared my agreement to join the HOA. I calmly explained that my property wasn't part of Meadowbrook and that I had no intention of joining. That smile twitched for a split second before she composed herself and muttered something about a misunderstanding. I thought that was the end of it, but it was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, small annoyances began. Notices were taped to my door demanding yard maintenance, even though my lawn was mowed. I received warnings about noise violations, even though I live alone and rarely even turn on the TV. The HOA sent me a fine for unauthorized exterior paint. Even though I hadn't painted a thing, when I pushed back, I got silence. When I asked neighbors, they told me Helen had a habit of bullying anyone she couldn't control. They whispered stories of how she fined a retired veteran for flying the American flag on his porch, how she forced a widow to replace her rose bushes because they weren't in the approved color palette. I kept all correspondence and began documenting everything, knowing I might need proof. Then, one morning, I returned home from a grocery run to find a demolition crew in front of my house. My mouth went dry. My entire living room wall had been torn off. I screamed, ran toward the house, only to be stopped by 2 private security guards hired by the HOA. "We're acting on HOA orders," one said flatly, handing me a forged letter bearing a fake approval from the city. I called the police immediately, but when they arrived, Helen was already on site, spinning her tail. "We had no choice," she told the officers, placing a sympathetic hand over her heart. His house was violating multiple code ordinances. He ignored every warning. It was a public nuisance. I begged the officers to stop the demolition, but they claimed it was a civil matter and refused to intervene. I stood there, helpless, watching my childhood home crumble under excavator, claws reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. Helen watched with satisfaction, like she'd finally purged the one stain on her kingdom. That night I slept in my car, parked at the end of my own destroyed driveway. I cried until I couldn't anymore, then stared at the stars through my windshield and swore I would make her pay. I wasn't just going to sue high, was going to shut the whole HOA down. But I needed a plan, and I needed allies. The next morning, I started by reaching out to local news stations. No one bit right away, but I kept calling, emailing, and sharing the footage I had from my Ring camera that captured the start of the demolition and Helen giving the order. I also hired a lawyer, Mark Sullivan, a civil rights attorney who lived 2 towns over and had a reputation for despising corrupt HOAs. Mark was fierce, sharp, and didn't waste time sugarcoating. Told me straight up that winning wouldn't be easy, but with the video evidence, forged documents, and growing witness list, we had a shot. Within a week, Mark uncovered something massive. The HOA was never legally authorized to extend jurisdiction over my property. Helen had fabricated amendments and even used an unlicensed notary to backdate signatures. Meanwhile, neighbors began coming forward one by one, sharing their horror stories. Some feared retaliation, but others were ready to fight. One organized a small town hall in the community center, and to my surprise, over 60 residents showed up. Many of them were tired of Helen's reign of terror. An older couple told us Helen forced them to repaint their house 4 times in 1 year. A young mother tearfully explained how Helen fined her $500 for having a child's inflatable pool on the lawn. That night, we formed a legal coalition, and Mark filed a civil lawsuit not just against Helen, but against the entire HOA board. Still, Helen didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. She sent more fake violations, tried to evict me from the land, and even posted signs labeling me as a public hazard. But this time, I had the backing of a community. I set up surveillance, kept digital records, and took Helen to court. And then just when things couldn't seem to get more surreal, a city inspector, tipped off by the media, began investigating Helen's permits and uncovered a history of fraud. Helen had authorized illegal demolitions before, used HOA funds for personal expenses, and even sold parking access to local businesses without disclosure. The web of corruption unraveled fast. You'd think someone would have stopped her earlier. But like most bullies, she operated through intimidation and silence. The moment people started speaking up, she had nowhere to hide. But I wasn't just interested in exposing her. I wanted justice. I wanted every brick of my destroyed home to be accounted for. And more than that, I wanted to protect others from ever facing this kind of abuse. What happened next would shake the entire neighborhood and even make national headlines. But I'll tell you exactly how I took down an entire HOA empire in the coming chapters. So stick with me, because this is just the beginning. The fallout from the destruction of my home triggered something I hadn't anticipated: public outrage. Once my story aired on a small local news channel, thanks to one persistent journalist named Rachel, it began spreading like wildfire. Within days, media from across the state started calling me for interviews. I never wanted fame. I just wanted my house back, and the woman responsible held accountable. But every time I spoke publicly about Helen and the HOA's illegal actions, more victims reached out. Some were from my own community, while others were from neighboring cities' different HOAs. Same horror stories. The attorney, Mark Sullivan, used this momentum to pressure the city's planning department to conduct a full review of Helen's demolition order. That's when we got the smoking gun. The letter she showed the police was not just forged. It used a fake letterhead and a fake signature from someone who had retired 2 years ago. With that evidence in hand, Mark pushed forward with our civil suit, and we added charges of property destruction, fraud, trespassing, and defamation. The city finally issued a cease and desist order to the Meadowbrook Lakes HOA, and Helen was slapped with a subpoena. Her composure started to crack. She stopped walking around the neighborhood with her clipboard and signature sun hat, and for the first time, she kept her blinds closed. She knew something was coming, but she had no idea how deep our investigation would go. While the court case brewed, I still had no home, so one of the neighbors, a retired architect named Carl, offered me his guest house to stay in while things played out. Carl had been silently feuding with the HOA for years after they tried to force him to cut down an oak tree that had been in his family for generations. I accepted his offer and spent my days combing through every piece of HOA documentation I could get my hands on. That's when I noticed several inconsistencies in the HOA's financials. Annual dues were high, $1,200 per household, but most of the neighborhood amenities were in disrepair. The tennis court hadn't been resurfaced in a decade. The pool filtration system was broken half the summer. Yet according to the reports, expenses were being listed for maintenance monthly. Mark brought in a forensic accountant who began tearing through the numbers and found that nearly $200,000 in HOA funds over 5 years were unaccounted for. Some of it went to luxury purchases, travel, and consulting fees paid to a shell company registered to Helen's cousin. That's when things escalated. The HOA board started to fracture. 3 of its 5 members resigned and contacted Mark to negotiate immunity in exchange for cooperation. What they revealed was staggering. Helen had been running the HOA like a personal dictatorship. She bullied the board into rubber stamping everything, threatened to fine or smear anyone who resisted, and made decisions without meetings or votes. Some board members hadn't even been aware of the demolition order until it was already carried out. One even cried during their deposition, saying he wished he'd stood up sooner. The city council finally got involved after pressure from local media and public protest. They began drafting emergency legislation to limit HOA power within city limits, and a special committee was created to investigate HOA abuse citywide. Suddenly, I wasn't just a guy trying to rebuild his house. I was at the center of a movement. One afternoon, as I was organizing our legal documents, I got a knock on Carl's guest house door. It was Helen, standing alone, her usual arrogance gone. She looked smaller, frailer, like the years of false authority had been stripped away. She asked to talk. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside and listened. She didn't apologize, of course not. Instead, she tried to justify everything. She said I'd left her no choice, that the HOA had rules and structure and she was protecting property values. I asked her point blank, "Do you really think demolishing someone's house without legal authority is protecting property values?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked away. That moment made it clear she wasn't sorry, just scared. And she had good reason to be, because the civil case was just the start. Once the forensic accounting was completed and the fraudulent documents handed over to the district attorney, a criminal investigation was launched. Helen was officially indicted for multiple felonies, including fraud, embezzlement, falsifying public documents, and conspiracy. When the police finally arrived to take her in, the whole neighborhood watched from their porches. Some clapped, some cried. Few took pictures. I just stood silently at the edge of Carl's driveway, arms folded, watching as the woman who destroyed. My home was escorted into the back of a patrol car. That wasn't the end of the war, just the removal of the general. The HOA still existed, and my house was still gone. So I turned my focus toward complete dissolution of the Meadowbrook Lakes HOA. Legally, that required a majority vote from the community. Luckily, with 3 board members already gone and over 60% of residents now aligned against it, we had the numbers. But Helen had installed a few loyalists, and they tried everything to stop the vote tampering with ballots, spreading lies about what losing the HOA would mean, even claiming that homeowners would lose insurance or resale value. None of it worked. The vote passed by a landslide. Meadowbrook Lakes HOA was officially dissolved 6 months after my home was demolished. We threw a block party that night, and I gave a short speech thanking everyone who stood up, who believed in justice, and who refused to be bullied any longer. But the story doesn't end with the fall of the HOA or the arrest of its president, because now I had to rebuild. Literally. The court ordered Helen and the former HOA to pay restitution. And with help from the city and some crowdfunding efforts, I broke ground on a new house. This time, better, stronger. A symbol that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, can destroy a person's home and walk away unpunished. But just when I thought it was over, something unexpected happened that would take this fight to an even bigger stage. And what came next, I never could have seen coming. A few weeks after the block party, celebrating the dissolution of the Meadowbrook Lakes HOA, I received an unexpected email from a woman named Jenna Taylor, a legislative aide working with a state senator who had been following my case closely. She said my story had been cited in a recent debate at the state capitol about the unchecked power of HOAs and the urgent need for reform. The senator wanted to meet in person to discuss possible legislative changes. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't even an activist. But Jenna made it clear they weren't looking for polished speeches. They wanted the raw, real story from someone who lived it. So I agreed. A few days later, I was sitting across from Senator Mitchell in a polished government office in the state capitol. Explaining every detail from the first notice Helen shoved in my mailbox to the day a bulldozer sat on top of the ashes of my home. He listened intently, nodding and taking notes. And by the end of our meeting, he told me he was drafting a new homeowner protection bill that would include mandatory oversight of HOA actions, harsher penalties for overreach, and guaranteed appeal. Rights for homeowners. It felt surreal that my nightmare might actually lead to something good. Meanwhile, back in Meadowbrook, the house was slowly taking shape again. I worked with a local architect to design something that honored the old structure but included modern updates, a front porch that wrapped around the side, energy-efficient insulation, and an expanded kitchen. I spent my days on site, hammering, measuring, and sometimes just watching the progress while drinking coffee. Neighbors would drop by and check in, some offering homemade meals, others bringing supplies. Carl, who'd let me stay in his guest house, became like a father figure to me during the process. We shared stories, built furniture together, and occasionally went fishing just to decompress. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace returning to my life. But Helen's ghost still lingered, though she was out on bail and awaiting trial. Her presence loomed in the form of those she had influenced over the years. A handful of her die-hard supporters were now bitter and angry, claiming I had destroyed the community and ruined the value of the neighborhood. They posted venomous comments online, harassed neighbors who had supported me, and even tried to sue the newly formed neighborhood council that replaced the HOA. The lawsuit failed almost instantly. Tossed out by the judge for lack of standing, but it stirred tension in the neighborhood. One night, someone egged the frame of my new house. Another time, I found nails spread across the gravel driveway. I knew it was a small faction of angry people who couldn't accept that. Helen had manipulated them and was now being held accountable. But it reminded me that victory didn't mean safety not yet. Then came the day that changed everything again. I was in the middle of painting the kitchen walls when my phone rang. It was Mark, my attorney, and his voice sounded different tense. Clipped, he told me I needed to come down to the courthouse immediately. The Department of Justice had just filed federal charges against Helen not just for the HOA crimes, but for a series of older financial crimes connected to a larger real estate scam. Apparently, years ago, Helen had been involved in several shady land deals using front companies to buy distressed properties under fake names, renovate them with stolen HOA funds, and flip them at a profit. These crimes stretched across state lines, and some of the documents tied back to the same fake signature used in my demolition order. Now, the feds were involved. This went beyond local fraud. This was racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. On a massive scale, DOJ was building a RICO case, and I was being asked to testify. I couldn't believe it. The woman who tried to ruin me, who thought she was above the law, was now facing a possible 20 years in prison. Over the next few weeks, federal agents interviewed me several times, handed over every document, video clip, voice recording, and news article I had. It turned out, my case had been the linchpin, what the prosecutors needed to tie Helen's local corruption to her national-level fraud. At the federal hearing, I testified for 3 hours. I described in painful detail the morning I found my home reduced to rubble, the forged letters, the manipulation of the board, the missing funds, the community's vote to dissolve the HOA, and everything that followed. Helen sat just feet away, pale and expressionless, but I refused to look away. I told the court what she'd done, how she'd weaponized authority, and how she'd used a neighborhood meant for peace and community as her own personal fiefdom. By the end, the courtroom was silent. When I stepped down, the judge thanked me for my courage. A few weeks later, the verdict came down. Helen was found guilty on all charges, state and federal. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution, which included the complete rebuilding costs of my home, along with damages to others, fines, and back taxes. But more importantly, she was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted. I didn't cheer, I just sat there, feeling the full weight of what had finally been delivered. Justice. In the aftermath, the media exploded with coverage. News outlets from across the country called this one of the biggest HOA scandals in decades. My story wasn't just a headline anymore. It became a documentary, a podcast series, and even a case study in several law schools. But I didn't care about fame. All I cared about was rebuilding my life and ensuring this never happened to anyone else again. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with Senator Mitchell's team to finalize the bill, which passed with overwhelming support and became law, the Homeowner Protection and HOA Reform Act. It mandated oversight committees, criminal penalties for fraudulent board actions, and created a statewide grievance board for homeowners. It wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for thousands. And through it all, I finally saw the house completed. The day I moved in, the neighborhood came together for a small ceremony. Carl handed me the keys and we all shared a quiet moment. On the new porch, looking out over the lake, it was peaceful. Finally. But even as I settled into my new home, I couldn't help but wonder what other communities were still under the thumb of HOAs like the one Helen ran. What other stories were being buried, silenced, or destroyed. And would anyone else have the strength to stand up like I did when the time came? It had been a few quiet months since Helen's conviction. And though the media had shifted its attention to new scandals, I continued to get calls and letters from people across the country, homeowners who had faced similar abuse from their HOAs but hadn't known how to fight back. Some had lost homes, others had been harassed into submission, and a few were still in the middle of battles they were sure they would lose. Reading their stories made it clear that Helen wasn't some isolated monster. She was part of a wider problem that had festered in silence for far too long. I realized I had a responsibility now, not just to move on with my life, but to use what had happened to me as a force for good. That's when I launched a nonprofit called Homeowners United. It started small, just me, Carl, and a few volunteers, answering emails and phone calls, but the response was overwhelming. Within a month, we had thousands of members and a full legal team offering free consultations to victims of HOA abuse. We partnered with state representatives and consumer rights organizations. And before long, Homeowners United became the loudest voice in the country, advocating for fair housing rights and HOA accountability. Every day brought new cases, and while some were straightforward, others were as outrageous as my own. A retired couple in Arizona had been fined $150 a day because their grandson's bike was visible on their porch. A disabled veteran in Florida had his service dog banned from common areas. A family in California lost their home when the HOA foreclosed over unpaid dues they never even received a notice about. These weren't just petty grievances, were systemic failures, and we were determined to change that. But with visibility came enemies. Not everyone was thrilled about our work. A coalition of powerful HOAs, backed by developers and real estate lobbies, began attacking our nonprofit publicly. They accused us of spreading misinformation, of encouraging homeowners to break rules, and of undermining neighborhood harmony. They lobbied politicians, tried to shut down our funding sources, and even sent private investigators to dig into my past. One morning I found a man parked across from my house, taking photos. I walked right up to his car and asked what he was doing, and he stammered something about real estate surveys before driving off. I knew intimidation when I saw it. Carl urged me to get security cameras, so I installed a full system around the house and at the Homeowners United office. Then came the lawsuit. One of the largest HOA management companies in the country filed a defamation suit against us, claiming we were damaging their reputation with false claims and unverified horror stories. They demanded we shut down the site and pay millions in damages. It was a clear attempt to silence us through legal bullying, but we didn't back down. Instead, we launched a legal defense fundraiser that raised over $500,000 in just a week. Our lawyers countersued, and soon enough, discovery revealed that the management company had its own pile of skeletons' hidden fees. Falsified records, illegal foreclosures. The lawsuit quickly fell apart, and they dropped it before trial. But the ordeal had only made us stronger. More lawyers joined our cause, more donors stepped up, and our community grew tighter and louder. Meanwhile, life in Meadowbrook Lakes had become something else entirely. Without the HOA controlling every aspect of daily life, the community had blossomed. Neighbors painted their houses in colors that brought vibrancy back to the streets. Kids played openly in front yards, no longer threatened with fines for sidewalk chalk drawings. Elderly residents who had once feared board retaliation now hosted potlucks and garden clubs. A new neighborhood council was formed not to enforce power, but to coordinate community events and represent homeowner concerns fairly. I was elected chair not because I wanted to be in charge, but because people trusted that I would never let anyone like Helen rise again. Still, there were those few holdouts, former board loyalists, who missed the control. The order, the ability to bully and punish those they saw as beneath them. They remained bitter, occasionally filing noise complaints or scribbling passive-aggressive notes about landscaping. But with no HOA authority behind them, their complaints went nowhere. They were just neighbors now, with no more power than anyone else. And that equality, that balance, was something we protected fiercely. As Homeowners United continued to grow, we began developing software tools to help homeowners track their dues. understand their rights, and file formal complaints. We published a handbook called Know Your HOA, which became a bestseller in several states. Trained neighborhood advocates, held town halls, and even launched a podcast where victims could share their stories anonymously. Each voice added to the growing demand for reform, and soon, we had allies in dozens of state legislatures. By the end of the year, 5 new states passed laws modeled after the original Homeowner Protection and HOA Reform Act that I helped bring to life. What started with my demolished home was becoming a national movement. Yet even with all this progress, I never forgot what had been taken from me. I still remembered the sound of the bulldozer, the numbness in my chest when I saw the pile of splinters where my living room had been, the humiliation of watching Helen smirk as if it was all just a game. That trauma didn't vanish, but I had reshaped it into purpose. Every house we helped save, every lawsuit we helped dismiss, every homeowner we empowered, that was another brick laid in rebuilding, not just homes, but dignity. Then, just when I thought the past was finally behind me, a reporter reached out. She said there was something new in Helen's file, something not disclosed during the trial. Apparently, Helen had been part of a private network of HOA board members and management companies that coordinated tactics for controlling neighborhoods, maximizing fines, and even strategic evictions. It sounded like a conspiracy theory at first, but when the reporter showed me leaked emails and recordings, my stomach turned. It was real. They called themselves the HOA Leadership Syndicate, and they had operated in secret for nearly a decade. Helen wasn't just a rogue actor. She had been following a playbook. And while Helen was now in prison, many others in the network were still active, running HOAs across the country using the same manipulative methods. The reporter asked if I would help break the story. Without hesitation, I said yes. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The moment I agreed to help expose the HOA Leadership Syndicate, everything shifted into a new gear. I was no longer just fighting local corruption. I was going up against a national operation that had spent years embedding itself into housing communities and manipulating homeowners through carefully constructed rules and intimidation tactics. The investigative journalist, Rachel Keene, had already gathered damning evidence, emails, financial records, training documents, and even internal videos showing seminars where HOA board members were taught how to maximize revenue through fines and how to sideline non-compliant residents. I was shocked at the scale of it. These weren't just one-off abuses. This was an organized, profit-driven system of oppression dressed up as community management. Helen had been a star participant in this network, even mentoring other board presidents across the country. The deeper we dug, the more apparent it became that hundreds if not thousands of homeowners had suffered similar fates to mine, and most never got justice. Some had been driven to bankruptcy, others into homelessness, and more than a few had simply given up and walked away from their homes. It was a machine, and Helen had only been one of many gears. Rachel and I began working together to craft a documentary exposed that would hit harder than any lawsuit ever could. We interviewed victims, whistleblowers, and even former HOA employees who had resigned in disgust. I shared my story in detail, from the day I refused to sign the HOA agreement to the moment my cabin was demolished, and how I rose from the ashes to lead a movement. Each story added another layer to the growing case against the syndicate. But as the project neared completion, the backlash began. First came the threats, anonymous letters, phone calls in the middle of the night, vague warnings to back off before it's too late. Then came the digital sabotage. Our nonprofit website was hacked twice, and personal information of several of our staff members was leaked online. Rachel received photos of her kids' school schedules in her mailbox. Someone wanted to silence us, and they were playing dirty. But we weren't backing down. If anything, the intimidation confirmed just how important this story was. We went to the FBI with everything, and to our surprise, they were already watching the HOA syndicate. Apparently, they had been building a case for over a year but lacked the kind of insider access and media exposure that our work could provide. With our help, the investigation accelerated. Federal agents began quietly auditing HOA bank accounts, issuing subpoenas, and tracking the flow of money through shell companies linked to the syndicate. What they found was staggering tens of millions of dollars laundered through fake landscaping, services, security contracts, and inflated maintenance fees. It was more than just abuse of power, it was organized crime. By the time the expos aired on national television, the FBI was ready. In a coordinated sweep, they raided over 30 HOA offices across 10 states, arrested board members, seized servers, and froze accounts. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, HOA syndicate was trending everywhere. Lawmakers demanded hearings, homeowners launched class action lawsuits, and dozens of corrupt board members resigned overnight. Helen's case was re-examined and used as a benchmark for the kind of criminal manipulation that had gone unchecked for too long. Though she was already in prison, more charges were added to her record. She became the face of everything wrong. With unchecked HOA authority, meanwhile, Meadowbrook Lakes continued thriving as a true community. More secret board meetings. No more fines for mailbox colors. No more fear. Our new neighborhood council passed a resolution to forever ban any mandatory HOA from forming again in our area. Other communities across the country followed suit, inspired by our story. The state legislature introduced sweeping reforms, many of them written with input from our nonprofit Homeowners United. Soon, HOA boards were required to register with the state. Financial transparency became law, and homeowners gained the legal right to appeal and challenge rules without retaliation. What started as a personal tragedy had sparked a national reckoning. Despite the legal victories and widespread change, I still lived in a modest cabin rebuilt on the same plot where the original once stood. I kept the design simple, left a piece of scorched wood from the old porch mounted on the wall as a reminder of where it all began. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the fight, the sacrifice, and the thousands of people who joined me in. Refusing to be silenced, our nonprofit grew into a full-fledged advocacy network. With offices in multiple states and ongoing partnerships with legal aid groups and housing reform coalitions, I became a frequent guest speaker at conferences and panels, and I testified before Congress on HOA abuses. Still, I never saw myself as a hero, just a homeowner who refused to be pushed around. One night, while sitting on the porch watching the stars, Rachel called to tell me the FBI had completed their investigation. Over 200 arrests had been made. The syndicate's leaders were facing RICO charges. The scam was officially dismantled. But she warned me that smaller versions would inevitably try to rise again. They always do, she said. But this time, they'll know we're watching. I promised her that our fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. More than ever, it became clear that protecting people's homes wasn't just about property. It was about preserving dignity, freedom, and the right to live without fear of exploitation. I decided to write a book, chronicling the journey from victim to advocate. From the moment a bulldozer destroyed my home to the moment I stood in Congress demanding justice. I called it Demolished, not Defeated. It quickly climbed the charts and became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. It wasn't just my story, it was theirs too. Now, if you're watching this and wondering if your HOA has crossed the line, if you've been fined unfairly or bullied into silence, I'm here to tell you that you're not alone. You don't have to accept it. Stand up, speak out, and fight back. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel for more powerful stories like this, where real people take down corruption with courage. Because justice starts with knowing your rights and demanding them. The aftermath of the national exposure left a deep, permanent mark on the way HOAs operated across the country, but it also reshaped my life in ways I hadn't expected. While the media attention settled into a steady stream of interviews and public speaking requests, I began focusing on expanding the mission of Homeowners United. What started as a small neighborhood support group had become a grassroots juggernaut, receiving thousands of messages weekly from desperate homeowners. All across the country, some had their homes foreclosed after missing one HOA payment. Others were fined into bankruptcy over absurd rule violations, things like drying towels on balconies, planting the wrong species of flowers, or painting their shutters in unapproved shade of blue. I realized that our story wasn't rare, was just rarely told. Our fight had inspired people to come forward, but the injustice was far from over. It was clear to me that awareness alone wasn't enough. These people needed legal support, policy change, and representation, and I was in a position to give them that. I assembled a team of lawyers, former housing officials, community leaders, and passionate volunteers who shared the same vision. We expanded our hotline, created legal aid partnerships, and launched a series of community defense seminars where homeowners learned how to navigate, challenge, and dismantle abusive HOA practices in their own neighborhoods. Within months, our organization had representation in over 20 states, with full chapters forming in California, Texas, Florida, and Arizona, some of the worst-hit regions. And yet, through it all, I never stopped thinking about that moment. When I stood watching my home collapse into splinters beneath a bulldozer, that moment had burned itself into me. It was the core of my fire. And as I watched other families, single mothers, veterans, retirees, immigrants recount how their own homes were stolen from them, I understood just how deep this wound ran across the nation. These weren't just financial losses, they were attacks on people's identities, legacies, and peace of mind. One of the most heartbreaking cases I helped with involved an elderly widow in Nevada named June Harper. She'd lived in the same house for 42 years, paid off her mortgage, spent her golden years gardening and caring for her disabled son. But her HOA fined her repeatedly for failing to trim her hedges to the exact height stated in the guidelines. Tasks she couldn't perform due to arthritis and her son's full-time care. The fines compounded until they claimed her property in an HOA lien auction. She was evicted. When I heard her story, I flew out there personally. We brought cameras. We rallied the media. Our legal team filed an injunction and pushed for immediate restitution. It was a battle, but we got her home back. That case became another high-profile example in a wave of renewed interest in HOA overreach. From there, more states started passing Harper laws aimed at protecting vulnerable homeowners from losing their properties over minor code violations. But I also knew that legislative change was slow and always under threat of reversal. So I took our message to the voters. We began building an advocacy campaign, collecting stories and endorsements from victims, influencers, and even some local celebrities who had quietly suffered HOA abuse in silence. We launched public awareness, commercials, billboard campaigns, and school programs to educate people on housing rights. Then I had an idea that changed everything. We bought back the land where my original cabin stood, including the entire lot surrounding the lake and the former HOA's old office building. With donations pouring in and the growing strength of our movement, we transformed the space into the first ever Freedom from HOA Abuse Center, a hybrid museum, legal hub, and training facility dedicated to fighting abusive HOA systems nationwide. The center hosted seminars, offered free legal consultations, displayed exhibits of documented abuses, photos of bulldozed homes, copies of outrageous fine notices, and a memorial wall of those who died homeless after being forced out of properties they once owned. People came from all over the country to visit, to learn, and to heal. And on the anniversary of the day Helen ordered my house demolished, I gave a speech to a crowd of hundreds outside that center, right where my front porch used to be. I said, they thought this land belonged to their rules, but now it belongs to the people. The crowd roared. But the war wasn't over. A new wave of corporate investors had started buying homes in bulk, slipping themselves onto HOA boards and using their votes to push through hyper-aggressive enforcement policies. These so-called investment HOAs were rapidly becoming the next front in the battle. I shifted my attention to stopping them, working with housing economists and watchdog agencies to expose their tactics. We developed software tools that tracked violations, fines, and patterns of abuse by zip code, allowing homeowners to build digital evidence packages that stood up in court. We also launched a whistleblower portal for HOA employees, contractors, and even board members who wanted to leak information about illegal practices without fear of retaliation. Tips poured in daily. We had cracked open the vault and people were finally speaking out. All of this made me a target, of course. There were smear campaigns, legal threats, and even a suspicious fire at our Arizona office. Thankfully, no one was hurt. I kept my team tight and my security tighter, but I never let it stop me. The truth had momentum now, and nothing they did could put it back in the box. Eventually, the Department of Housing and Urban Development partnered with us to conduct a nationwide audit of HOA organizations, citing our research and stories as the foundation of their inquiry. It was surreal to think it all started with one demolished cabin. At night, I often found myself staring at old photos of that home before the war began. The quiet lake, the aging pine wood, the hammock I used to nap in. I missed the simplicity of those days, but I also knew that losing it had given me a purpose far greater than anything I ever planned for. And then, just when I thought we had turned the tide, a whistleblower tipped us off to something massive. A private network of real estate developers planning to install a new HOA syndicate across 400 upcoming residential neighborhoods. The documents were signed, the plans underway. It was the same playbook, just with new names and faces. The moment I read the files, I knew this was going to be our biggest battle yet. And it wouldn't just be about policy anymore, it would be about preventing an entire generation of homeowners from falling into the same trap. We mobilized immediately, because if they thought we were done, they were about to learn just how far we were willing to go to protect our homes, our families, and our freedom. The revelation of the HOA syndicate's massive expansion plan felt like déjà vu, only now the stakes were national and the scale was monstrous. With blueprints detailing over 400 new neighborhoods, complete with pre-approved investor-backed HOAs written into their charters. The scheme was clearly meant to ensure permanent control over entire communities before the first families even moved in. These weren't just homeowner associations anymore. These were corporate control. Grids wrapped in the illusion of neighborhood management. And this time, they were smarter, subtler. The language in their founding documents was buried beneath hundreds of pages of legal code, using vague phrasing like protective covenants, community standards, and investment protections, but we saw through it. My team now, including a network of pro bono lawyers, whistleblower protection agents, digital analysts, and policy strategists, assembled an airtight response. First, we leaked the documents to every major news outlet. Under embargo, coordinating the publication of the expos across print, broadcast, and online media, all on the same morning. When it hit, it was like a lightning strike. People were outraged. Parents who had just purchased homes in these new developments began filing lawsuits claiming they were never told about the extent of HOA power being baked into their property. Deeds videos of our team breaking down the schemes went viral to make the public's reaction even louder. We held a live-streamed press conference outside the still-standing ruins of what used to be my first cabin. Now enshrined in glass, at the Freedom from HOA Abuse Center, with hundreds gathered and thousands watching online, I stood there with the leaked documents in hand and told the world they buried these clauses because they feared what you'd do if you saw them. Well, now you've seen them. What will you do next? The floodgates opened. Politicians couldn't stay silent anymore. Congressional hearings were called, and I was invited to testify alongside victims of this new wave of planned HOA abuse. I sat there at the table, staring across at lawmakers while June Harper, the elderly woman whose house we'd saved months earlier, tearfully recounted how nearly everything she owned was stolen by the system. Cameras captured every moment.
Ow.
News cycles didn't stop for days. The pressure mounted until two of the major developers announced voluntary halts on their HOA expansions. But we didn't stop there. Our legal team filed injunctions on every proposed community tied to the syndicate, freezing dozens of pending housing projects until full transparency could be enforced. We also drafted a new federal bill, the Homeowner Autonomy Act. Its core provisions banned any mandatory HOA clauses from being pre-written into residential deeds unless they received notarized consent from buyers. It also required third-party audits of all HOA finances, guaranteed the right of homeowners to challenge fines before an independent review board, and criminalized the enforcement of HOA liens without judicial approval. It was the boldest legislation of its kind ever proposed, and thanks to the groundswell we built, it passed with bipartisan support. The moment the bill was signed into law, I returned home. Not to a house because I never rebuilt mine, but to the lake where it all started. I sat on the edge of the dock, the one place the HOA had never touched, and let the breeze hit my face. I thought of Helen, how one person's obsession with control sparked a nationwide rebellion. I thought of the people we'd helped, the homes we'd saved, the rights we'd restored. And I realized something powerful. My house may have been demolished, but in losing it, I found a calling that couldn't be destroyed. Eventually, I did build a new cabinot on the ruins of the old one. But further up the hill, overlooking the lake, far from any roads or rules, it was simple, just like the first one. But this time, it stood as a monument, not just to resilience, but to revolution. I hosted retreats there for victims of HOA abuse, for lawmakers writing policy, for lawyers preparing lawsuits. It became a sanctuary and a school all at once. And now, years later, Homeowners United has over 100,000 members, multiple legal wins, and chapters in all 50 states. HOAs still exist, yes, but not unchecked, not unquestioned. They now fear the very people they once bullied into silence. And as for the HOA that demolished my house, it no longer exists. Its charter was revoked. Its office was sold. Its former president, Helen, was eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, destruction of property, and criminal conspiracy. I didn't attend her sentencing. I had better things to do, like helping a single father in Georgia get his home back, or assisting a veteran in Ohio erase $18,000 in bogus fines. Every day since the bulldozers came, I've been rebuilding not just my home, but a movement. And if you're watching this, if you've made it this far in our story, I want you to remember one thing. You don't need to be a lawyer or a politician to stand up to injustice. You just need the courage to say no when someone tells you they own your peace. That moment of defiance is where freedom begins. And if you're ready to join that fight to protect your home, your family, your neighbors, then you're exactly the kind of person we need. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel to hear more true battles like this one. Help us spread the truth that ASOS don't own your life. You do.